And then how many people already are familiar with On Purpose? Okay. Well, I think that's probably a good place to start. Tom, I won't attempt to do his career justice, but in brief, studied science at Cambridge undergrad and as a PhD in chemistry, I believe, and other topics that are way above me. Was doing cancer research, but transitioned from academia, from science, then to management consulting with McKinsey for about 5 years, and then segued into the nonprofit world with Greg and Comic Relief before starting On Purpose. And to give the context for them, that is, and we can return to it later, but would love to know from you directly what void you were filling when you started On Purpose, and what motivated the jump from sector to sector, finally ending up where you are now.
Sure, great. Well, thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Charlie, for being involved in this, and also to Sheila for having done a lot of the logistics and helping out with organising things. What motivated starting On Purpose to some degree was it replicates my own journey, I suppose, from having started out working life in management consultancy in the private sector, but having done so with an explicit thought in my mind that I wanted to learn a bunch of skills that I could then apply in a non-profit, or I thought at the time international development world. And having been through that experience, I had lots of people come to talk to me about that, and they wanted to know, well, how did you do that? How did you make that transition? I want to make that transition. I want to do something similar. So I had a kind of an idea that there's a supply of people who are interested in this, and that might be something we should facilitate. I'd also, through working in a bit more of the commercial world, I guess come to realize the genuine kind of power and of using commercial dynamics or market dynamics, and using that to achieve social and environmental benefit, or social environmental impact, as we might say these days. And realized that although maybe my original motivation was around international development, I'd never worked in Africa or India myself, and actually, I should maybe start on my doorstep, and there's plenty of kind of thinking and experimenting and exciting things happening in this social enterprise space, as we call it now, in the UK, and actually trying to make a contribution to that was probably what I was much better suited to. So that's the kind of couple of things that I suppose led to it.
And then On Purpose itself has training programs, associate level, CEO level, about a year in duration. Do you want to talk briefly? Not as a plug for it, but just to give you more color in what.
Yeah. So we ran two programs. Our main program, which is what we started with in 2010, is our associate program, which is a 1-year full-time program. We have several, one current and 2 alumni, or 2 current and 1 alumni, I get confused these days, apologies. People here from the program, which is great. It combines actual kind of on-the-ground work experience in organizations that are quite generally combining social and commercial ways of working, so they're not necessarily social enterprises per se, because this kind of approach, this mentality can actually happen in pretty much any part of the economy. So it combines that with weekly training and quite intensive mentoring and coaching, and of course, really importantly, a peer group of people to kind of go through a career transition with. That's our kind of core program. We started that a few years ago in Paris as well, and more recently in Berlin. And then the CEO program that you mentioned is a more recent innovation for us. That is for CEOs or MDs of organizations, again, that very wide sweep from charities to social enterprises to SMEs, but who are kind of at a 1 to 10 million pound turnover, so often are facing a similar set of challenges and opportunities, and in that way united, I suppose, in some of those things. And that is a 6-month program, but obviously not full time, because it's difficult to take, if you're the CEO or the MD, that amount of time out of your business. So it's like an executive program, a certain number of days over those 6 months.
Fantastic. And then the title of this conversation was An Economy That Works for All. Of course, the implication being that our current one does not. So what is wrong with it?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure. I think most people these days would agree that our economy is not working that well. although I won't take a straw poll right now. But one of the things that I think that indicates that is there was a recent report by a think tank called the IPPR, which you may have seen, which essentially, I think states that and makes recommendations about how to improve things. And interestingly, I heard someone from the IPPR speak about it, and he was actually saying that one of the really interesting things and the things that he thinks has changed fairly recently is that this report, at least that starting point, has been fairly uncontroversial across the entire political spectrum. So I think, and that's a good thing, people are realizing that our economy is not really working as it should do. Maybe worth just spending a minute or two on well, what should an economy be doing? What does that mean? And for me, at the very basic level, the economy is the way we organize how to produce the services and goods that we need. And for me, that's that we need for human flourishing, if you like. And we have to do that within the parameters of living in a world that has finite resources and is, as we increasingly realize, quite sensitive. And can't just keep on giving us as many resources as we like, or taking up as much waste as we give it. So that for me is the kind of framing for an economy that works. It has to produce to everyone, for everyone, the goods and services that everyone needs to be able to flourish, and we have to do that within the kind of framework of the world that we live in, that we inhabit. And I think if you think about it that way, it becomes fairly obvious that there's quite a few things aren't working. So very obviously there are a lot of people who who cannot access or afford the services or products that they need, be that in developing economies, but actually also in this country. Lots of people who cannot afford to buy the food that they need, who use food banks, people who are still largely unbanked, even in this country, who do not have the credit histories or whatever to be able to kind of access mainstream financial services, and many, many more. So we have a problem on that first element of actually providing all the goods and services that we need. We have, needless to say, a very big problem on the second part as well, which is trying to do this within the framework of the environment that we live in. I'm sure I don't have to rehearse all the various parts of that, but maybe just to kind of point you towards one quite helpful framework, which is designed by the Stockholm Resilience Institute, which has defined 9 planetary boundaries, as they call them. And these are, the kind of important Earth's resources or Earth's sinks that we, through our economic activity or human activity, are using. And of those 9, they're trying to quantify where we're actually at. They haven't quite quantified all of them yet, but at least on 2 or 3 of them, we're actually already beyond the planetary boundaries that we should be. A couple of those being phosphate and nitrate usage in agriculture and so on. So these are not necessarily the ones you'd expect. But the second one is much publicised around biodiversity. And for me, just as one kind of example, the recent WWF report, if anyone remembers hearing that on the radio or the TV a couple of weeks ago, is shocking. If you kind of translate that into when I was born, there were twice as many animals in the world as there are now. We're not talking twice as many species of animals, we are talking twice as many animals. So we've kind of done away with 50% of the animal population of this world, since when I was born in 1974. In fact, the report quoted, I think that since 1970 we've done away with 60% of the animal population. I mean, that to my mind is just mind-boggling. And the thing is, the trend's probably just accelerating at the moment, and we really need to reverse some of this.
In your mind personally, is there a consensus where you trace the breakdown of a system that once was working, or is it an ideal that we've always strived for and just now are particularly far from achieving?
That's a very good question, and it's always. I don't know whether there was ever a system that did. I mean, tens of thousands of years ago when we were hunter-gatherers, I guess you can say, well, we probably weren't putting undue pressures on the planet at that point, but would we want to go back to that stage? Well, I guess probably not. But I think there are certainly ways that you can kind of trace some of what is happening now, or you can maybe try and see some of the underlying causes, or some of maybe slightly more root causes. of what is happening now. And I think there's a there are a few of those. Quite a lot of them have to do, I think, with the quite fundamental underlying values that we, especially in the West, in Western societies, kind of conform to, believe in, talk about, almost unconsciously, unknowingly. Things like, at the level of kind of liberalism, individualism, rationalism, reductivism, etc., etc. These are things that have built up, in the last 200-300 years, incrementally. But I do think that the kind of the changes to our collective values have also, in some ways, maybe kind of accelerated in the last 100 years or so, or that it's certainly possible to kind of point to some quite specific ones that have happened more recently. Just to give you an idea of that, of what I think of one of these value changes, which has certainly occurred and creates difficulties for us. And this is these are not my ideas. This one in particular comes from a talk I heard from an economist called Mariana Mazzucato at UCL, I believe. And she talks about the fact that historically economists used to have a theory of value. So until the kind of first half of the 20th century, theory of value was always hotly discussed. Economists would have debates about, where does value come from? Does it come from land? Does it come from employees? Does it come from technological innovation? And so on and so forth. Interestingly, what happened kind of at some point, probably the first half of the 20th century, is that debate kind of went away. And it kind of went away because we espoused the idea that value is shown by price, or that price is a good indicator of value. And now that is in itself a theory as well, and you could have a debate about that. But the interesting thing is, not only do we all just take that for granted now, but we don't actually have the debate anymore. So that is no longer a point of debate. That is now economics 101. Price indicates value. Let's move on to the next stuff. So it's a kind of an ingrained assumption, as opposed to a point of discussion and debate. And that's difficult at two levels, because one is, I think you can disagree with the fact that value is genuinely indicated by price, and secondly, the fact that we don't even debate it anymore is difficult in its own right. So that's just an example of some of the values that are going on. Some of the things that thing gives rise to are, our society is increasingly what I would call marketized. We make markets responsible for all kinds of stuff, which are not necessarily appropriate. It's almost like we're outsourcing some of our kind of, what I would almost consider some of our moral duties to markets. Did you know that in Santa Barbara, you can pay, when you're in prison, you can pay $90 a night to upgrade? You can have a nicer prison experience by paying more. I mean, that's kind of an interesting moral kind of thought, isn't it? Should that be allowed? Is that okay? But you can just say, well, hey, if people will pay for it, that's fine. Is that fine, or is that not fine? Or is that kind of, not really what prison is for? I don't know. But you can take that to all kinds of other places as well. The kind of whole idea of markets in public services, of choice, of consumer choice, and whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. It certainly has benefits, but I think it also has some drawbacks, and so on and so forth. And with that, then a kind of whole, not with that, but with it or separately, a whole kind of economic agenda, which I believe, and this is what often gets me going, I think is quite ideological, which you'd label these days as neoliberal economic agenda, which established itself or kind of got going in the late 40s by something called the Mont-Pelerin Group, which included people like Hayek and Friedman and so on, and was kind of harking back to the classical economists such as Adam Smith, etc. But in my view, actually only ever taking parts of what they said and not necessarily taking the full story, not necessarily interpreting things entirely completely, taking parts of that, building it into quite an ideological framework, and then of free markets, and then being very strategic in how they wanted to propagate that through society. So being funded by some very big, rich donors, strategically funding professorships, think tanks, political advisors, etc., etc. And of course, that came to a head in about 1980 with the election of Reagan in the US and Thatcher in this country. So I'll stop there. There are many more kind of examples that we could give there, but that's, I think, some of the kind of underlying things. They're quite fundamental, values, beliefs, and so on that we hold. But I think ultimately they give rise to a lot of these things, which then, culminate in our kind of obsession with growth, our profit orientation, and so on and so forth, which you can then directly start linking to, for example, the environmental issues we have, and of course a big one, which is inequality.
Yeah. Looking back on your time in the private sector with McKinsey, do you think of it as an evolving consciousness, where you had a sense that this isn't the best use of I'm developing good skills, but this perhaps isn't my purpose, the best use of my talent? Or was there like an aha moment where you felt, how did you arrive to, because I heard you use the term long game, which I think is really interesting, that a lot of us, especially millennials, feel like we have to instantly know our reason for being here and to have some sort of impact. But as your career shows, you can become a more valuable asset having perhaps worked elsewhere. And what's cool about On Purpose is applying, is training people in, it's not charity work, but it's making them valuable assets to social enterprises. So curious to know if that was something that you gradually came to, or if there was this sort of realization, like you woke up, what am I doing? This isn't right for me.
So I think to an extent I always had that, and I think I went into management consultancy in my mind quite explicitly wanting to learn a bunch of skills and gather a set of experiences that I would then be able to take into a space that I had known for a long time before, and I wanted to ultimately work in and be able to make a difference to. So for me, I don't think it was a sudden aha moment in that sense. And I was maybe somewhat tactical, or you might say cynical, in doing that. But what I also want to say is that I don't want to portray kind of working somewhere like McKinsey or anywhere else for that matter as being on the dark side or whatever. I think the skills I learned there are incredibly helpful. The experiences I had were great. The people I worked with are, both within the organisation and the clients we served, incredible and by and large, all of them, well motivated, etc. And you can do a lot of good in those kind of systems as well. Now, for me personally, it became a kind of matter of, did that work for me and was that enough, or did I want to be elsewhere and I wanted to be elsewhere? But I think we need to be careful not to kind of paint these things as too black and white. Yes, sometimes it's easier in some places to find your own niche, but I'm convinced that one can kind of make a positive contribution to society in most places.
And in terms of how people understand a social enterprise versus an enterprise, impact investing versus investing, I feel like there's two schools. One is that in a perfect world, investing would be impact investing. It's built in. It's not a separate activity that's parallel to investing. Similar how there would need to be social enterprises, because every enterprise began with the premise that they should be also being stewards of the environment and have a social conscience. Where do you land on that, and what's the curriculum that's espoused on purpose?
So again, that's it's actually quite a big question. But I mean, in principle, yes, I would subscribe. Obviously, ultimately, we want every organisation to be a social enterprise. So yes, and therefore we want every investor to be a social investor. Yes. The question in my mind, which in some ways is the difficult one, is in the kind of current setup that we have, in the current way of doing things, if you like, in the current system, in the current way that we are incentivized, or we incentivize ourselves, either as individuals or as organizations, is that possible? So is it possible to maintain a kind of social focus and having a social environmental impact if you are going to be raising equity, and if the investor who is giving you that equity needs you to kind of grow however many times in a short period of time to make their own business model work, etc., etc. So to me, the kind of more interesting conversation is almost around those bigger things, which is that kind of systems thinking, which is, if you take the kind of reasonably logical argument that we live on a finite planet which has finite resources and finite sinks that can take up our waste, and we currently have an economy that measures itself purely on growth, on GDP growth, and GDP growth is directly linked to using resources and materials. That's difficult, because we are not going to be able to, if not logically impossible, we are not going to be able to grow indefinitely. And yet, a lot of the systems, a lot of the incentives that we have built up over the last, especially I'd say 150 years, have some of those built-in assumptions, and that's, I think, the difficult thing. How do we create enterprises that can grow enough to provide a return, if that's how we need to finance them? Well, how do we find other ways of financing organizations that maybe don't need to create financial returns? And that's not impossible, by the way. There's plenty of organizations that are self-funding. So it's not, not everything has to be equity funded. Big commercial companies that are self-funding as well and started up of their own accord. If we do need to generate a return, how do we do that in a way that doesn't create a situation where we're just incentivizing growth for growth's sake, and so on and so forth. And those are very complex issues, and are issues that I think are very difficult to kind of, or probably impossible to design, top down. We're not going to sit here and kind of go, this is how it needs to work. This is where I think it kind of comes back to the values, where actually I think we need to have that value conversation together. And if we manage to kind of, as it were, have a conversation and re-evolve or further evolve our values, then actually that will start kind of giving rise to all kinds of other things, and we'll then hopefully come up with a system that figures out how to do some of these things, which in our current mindset we think, well, how would we ever kind of fund most of the organizations that we have if they don't provide a 20-40% return or whatever it is that we need.
Since starting On Purpose in 2009, have you seen a shift in a positive direction? Are you optimistic about it?
Yeah, I am optimistic. I think you have to be optimistic.
Yeah.
For a couple of different reasons. So I think there is a shift. I think there's a shift on two fronts. I think there's a shift in terms of the people we see coming through the programs. It's much referred to, but the millennial generation, the generations after, are, I think, more switched on to this kind of stuff, and that's great. I hope, are becoming somewhat more vocal, and I hope we'll become more vocal as we go on, because that is necessary. Not to absolve the old generations as well, but that's a good thing. I think we also see kind of greater engagement from a whole wide range of organisations. Be that charities who are needing to think more commercially so that they can scale themselves more and have greater impact. Be that social investors and social enterprises that are trying to grow that particular niche. Or be that actually big companies who are engaging more and more for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because their investors are saying this is important. You look at whatever you think of it, but if you look at the letter written by the CEO of BlackRock last year or earlier this year, you can quibble with it, but just the fact that it happened is a big deal. Or the reinsurance industry, which has obvious incentives to try and make things better. But also I think, and this is where in some ways our, what we do it On Purpose kind of comes in a little bit, I often see a lot of this being driven by individuals in companies who want to make a difference, who, whatever my company does, whatever my organization does, I am motivated by, I am intrinsically motivated by by creating some social and environmental benefit, and I'm going to find a way of doing it within my job and within my organisation. And I always say that you see kind of especially big corporates doing interesting social and environmental things, and there are many of them. I always maintain that if you actually track it back to where that really happened, you will find an individual who was just enthusiastic and passionate about that. And of course they made a business case, but it didn't happen because they made a business case. They made a business case because they wanted to make it happen. And that's actually ultimately where we need to get to. We need to do these things because they're the right thing to do, and we need to find a way to do it, not find a way of making money, and then if that happens to be in a kind of way that generates some social impact, then so much the better.
Do you notice the difference in the three cities where you operate? Paris, Berlin, London. Is there a cultural or a policy difference that stands out?
There definitely is, yeah. there are big differences, and I'm no expert on either the French or German economies. I'm not even an expert on the UK one. But it is noticeable, and France and Germany are very different within themselves as well. But they do have different forms of capitalism, and they are proud of that, and rightly so. And that has knock-on effects on the kind of social enterprise worlds and so on. Sometimes I think we think in the UK that we're somehow, certainly within Europe, the kind of most advanced go-getting social enterprise movement and so on and so forth. And there is sometimes some truth in that. I think that there's probably more truth in that in the social investment space than necessarily the social enterprise space. But actually, you go to Paris, for example, and Berlin as well, but I know Paris a little bit better. We've been there a bit longer. There are social enterprises and there that are huge and doing stuff that we would kind of dream of here in the UK, to have some of the stuff that's going on at that kind of size over there. So there are interesting differences, but actually the most kind of exciting thing that I found was when I remember kind of when we were opening in Paris and we were kind of recruiting our first set of people to come onto the program, and we have kind of do a wide range of recruiting events, and we had one where we were meeting up with a bunch of people in a bar and having a bit of a talk and then drinks. And I was thinking, these French people going to get this? Is this going to work or whatever? But I came out of that evening going, oh wow, they do, and they have all the same kind of motivations, all the same challenges, all the same frustrations that we do here, and that's really exciting to see, because it is genuinely very universal. I think this desire to find a better way of organising ourselves, and that's a good thing, because it better be universal, because we've got to get on and make a difference.
There is, I imagine, the obstacle, at least in perception if not reality, that to do so you're sacrificing a more lucrative career potentially. Do you come up against that as a source of resistance for people who in theory agree with your premise and but aren't themselves willing to forego something at that time?
Yeah, no, that's I think that's a fact of life that we can't deny. I earn less than I used to. People who come on our programs temporarily earn a lot less. But sometimes it shouldn't be overplayed, because I think you can find places where you may not actually reduce your salary or not reduce your salary very much. I always say that interesting in the kind of social enterprise world, or in the there's actually a very wide range of salaries, in part because it's an emerging world and so no one quite knows what to pay people, but in part also because lots of different kind of people are coming in from lots of different kind of sectors and lots of different backgrounds, and so have different expectations of what should be paid. So you shouldn't assume that you will necessarily take a big pay cut. On the other hand, though, if you think about it rationally, two things. One is, and this sounds trite, but it's true. Ultimately, money doesn't make you happy. You need a certain amount to. You want to be able to live a comfortable life and so on. But it's not actually what's going to fulfill you. I know that's kind of very hackneyed, but talk to some of our people who've been through our programs, and even just the kind of exercise of living on a very low salary. Changes your perspectives on things, and does so in some unexpected ways. The other thing is, I read something a little while ago of someone who tried to kind of calculate world's GDP, and then from that deduced, okay, if this was equally distributed roughly amongst the world's population, how much will we actually all be kind of earning, as it were, in terms of GDP per head. And that's kind of quite an interesting exercise as well, and it's a lot less than we, on average, certainly in this room, I expect kind of earn. Now, I'm not saying we're all going to that's going to happen in the next 5 years, but over the long term, we need to find other ways of rewarding ourselves, other ways of leading fulfilling lives, which are not measured just by how much money we make. In the same way that as an organisation, I need to find other ways of measuring my success other than through profit, and in the same way that as an economy we need to desperately find an alternative to just measuring GDP.
You mentioned people who have gone through the program made me think it could be nice to hear actually from one or two of them, putting you totally on the spot because that wasn't planned, but if anyone here wants to just share a few words, because every person's path, it seems, is pretty unique to come to the program. Anyone?
Happy to do so, but what would you like to know?
What you did during your or what you're doing if it's going on right now.
Okay, sure. So just by way of background, I did spend 13 and a half years in banking previously, so I suppose I'm luckier than most in that I didn't have to worry as much about the financial security and savings, etc. But it's been a long time in the making. So years of umming and ahhing, and then at the end I basically thought, what is the worst that can happen? And as Tom alluded to, you don't necessarily need a huge income to survive. Even in London you might do, but in other places. But anyway, so I joined. I'm the April 18 cohort. There are 2 6-month intakes. And I did my first 6 months at Big Society Capital, which is a social impact investment wholesaler. And my second placement, where I'm about 6 weeks in, is at Shift, which is a social innovation charity that uses evidence-led and user-centered design-led approaches to building social ventures and designing products and solutions that try and address social issues. I would say that the experience has been phenomenal. I was speaking to some people earlier, and I've probably learned more in the past 7 months than I have in a long time. But it just opens your eyes to a whole world of opportunities, and gives you a lot of different perspectives around how things should be run, and also just opens your eyes to a lot of social issues that just are not picked up in the mainstream press.
Thank you.
So if you would. So I'm kind of 3 years out of the program now, so there's a little bit of perspective and distance, and I can only describe it as magic happened in that year. And it certainly wasn't an easy year, and I think that's an important thing to say. Like, it's kind of it's a big transition, and I think there's a lot of it is a real kind of acceleration in learning. I just background also kind of started out my career in finance, and spent so my 2 placements. The first was at RBS in their sustainability team, and the second was in a tech startup. So 2 very contrasting experiences. And to the extent I described a little bit what you were saying earlier on, like, we're kind of supposed to know our purpose. I think a really important part is that you only discover your purpose by kind of living and having experiences. And so there was this wonderful year where you're just collecting all this data about yourself, what you're good at, and the opportunity set available to you, both through your own experiences and the eyes and ears of your peer group, to come out of it and kind of, I guess, make intentional decisions going forward. I guess it influenced me so much that I then spent some time learning to code after my second placement, and spent the last couple of years in innovation consultancy. And I'm now actually working on, as Tom knows, and also kind of an adult learning experience, which is not too very much inspired by On Purpose, but I guess kind of at the intersection of tech and purpose, and how do we kind of create the leaders of tomorrow somewhere in that world.
Thank you.
Happy to speak quickly as well. So I finished the programme in September, so I'm the cohort just ahead of Kelly. And my background, slightly like Tom's, management consulting for 5 to 6 years, and was fairly aimless and directionless. And only when I finally admitted that, I really kind of had the nerve and a bit of financial sort of security behind me did I make the jump. And I feel definitely the power of the network and community has been the strongest element of the programme for me. The connections I've made through both the placement, coach and mentoring system, and crucially the cohort. So I'm now into a social enterprise, which was a friend of someone else on the programme gave me an introduction. So that's very directly led to my current employment. And yeah, my placement with NCS, National Citizen Service, which is a summer holiday long youth programme for 16-year-olds set up by the coalition government, the Big Society movement in sort of 2010, 2011, David Cameron led, and an in-house consultancy sort of function within the NHS. So it's sort of an internal NHS consultancy. Interestingly, neither of them are truly social enterprises, certainly now I am working in a social enterprise who are an organisation who help create partnerships between young people from ethnically and socially diverse backgrounds and corporate employers who want to become more diverse in their recruitment and working practices, so to help marry the two, so to help young people get into these corporate jobs, skills, training, coaching, the recruitment end, so everything, really the whole package, and help the companies ultimately become more diverse in the way they operate. And yeah, so really interesting for me now to be in that more entrepreneurial side of social business, which is also really impacted me.
Cool, thank you. Really interesting and diverse perspective. We didn't plan that. Fantastic. Is there anything you would like to address before we open up for questions?
Yeah, I think maybe just one last maybe point, which is that sometimes we can get a bit depressed about the kind of situation, and you hear all the kind of environmental news and the social difficulties and so on, and I think it's true that in some ways, as a kind of generation living now, we face probably some of the biggest challenges we as a race have had. And we do not have very long to sort that out. The most recent IPCC report was saying, we have 10, 12 years to kind of really to make some radical changes happen, and we're going to stick to the kind of 1.5 to 2 degree change agreed in the Paris climate talks. But the good news is we're probably also the first generation in the history of the world to actually have the knowledge and the tools to be able to sort this out. This is not impossible to do. This is primarily a matter of will and a matter of making it happen, rather than a kind of matter of knowledge or technology or whatever. So actually, it's quite upbeat because in the next few years we can make a real change happen. We've got to make a real change happen, and we can make things end up in a much better place than where we are now.
Apart from the animals, it's hard to.
Yeah, well, yeah. We need to start.
But there's science for that too.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure.
Please, questions for Tom about on purpose? Yeah, totally.
One of the questions I want to ask is, what role do you think impact investing is playing in the social enterprise movement? Sort of actually playing versus potentially it could play. The reason I ask is we did a landscape about 1.5 years ago. So we're a technology social enterprise, about 30 people in the international development club healthcare space. We looked really hard at taking on sort of impact investment, but the conundrum we kept on running into was exits. We couldn't find almost no examples, at least in our sector, of organizations that had either gone public, had been acquired, or had some type of exit events that sort of really made sense for an impact investor. I'm sort of curious from your perspective, there's been a lot of hype about impact investment, and I think maybe a little bit of hype cycle as well, some disillusionment with it. Where do you think it stands now? What role do you think it is currently playing, and what role do you think it should play?
It's interesting. I'm not sure if everyone in the room will kind of be up to speed with impact investing or social investment, as some of it's called as well. But just, I guess the very short version is that this is investments or investors who, broad generalization, but will probably accept a slightly lower financial return or in exchange for some social or environmental impact that their investments will generate. There has been a lot of hype about it, and there has been, especially in this country, a big push to get it going, and that's great. I think it's useful to have. I think the reason for me primarily why it's useful is that it's helping us think a little bit about what are these underlying values that we have. Should we be maximizing our returns financially? Or what other methodologies or what other kind of approaches are there? So from a kind of systems point of view, seeing it as a different way of trying to invest is for me almost the most interesting bit of what it's trying to do. The question that gets raised about it, or has been raised about it from a few different places, is interesting. Is it different enough? Is it just in some ways wholesale importing the kind of mindset of commercial investment into this space, and thereby almost kind of polluting, if you want to use a kind of emotive word, the kind of social enterprise or the wider non-profit world, and trying to get social enterprises to perform, at kind of financial levels that we shouldn't expect of them, because they're not precisely, usually not designed to maximize commercial returns like other companies might do. That's, I think, and I think there is a danger of that, and I'm not sure, and for me, I think the big question for the social investment movement is to kind of try and figure that out, to be able to walk that balance between, can we genuinely kind of do this differently with a different set of underlying values, with a different set of assumptions, and can we make that work, and not just kind of in some ways repeat or import all the values from the kind of more commercial world, because I think fairly manifestly, those values haven't worked when applied on a very big scale in the kind of in the financial world. And I'd love to see more kind of radical thinking around that, so how do we not necessarily how to invest in organisations in a social investment type of work, but for me the wider question is how do we resource organisations in a way that is going to be in line with an economy that works for all, and part of that solution will be investment that generates return, but the part of it is going to be finding other ways to resource organisations. I mean, the whole kind of crowdfunding area is quite an interesting example of that. And in theory, you can kind of again see is a different approach to things, and it's a different set of values coming in. In some ways, you could maybe say it's a more democratic way of doing things. It's also a way of doing it which doesn't necessarily actually need to generate a financial return, depending on what kind of crowdfunding you use, or it's more a financial return. So again, I think kind of at the moment we're in a kind of, at its best, we're kind of we're in an experimentation phase of trying to evolve different ways of resourcing organisations, I'm going to say, rather than investing in organisations, according to different sets of values. And I think we need to do more of that because I don't think the current versions that we have, although they're promising and they're great to have, and it's fantastic that it's generating a lot of ripples and a lot of awareness, they're not there yet.
I guess it's more about your on-purpose cohort and target students. It sounds to me that you're mostly educating people who already have mainstream business knowledge and financial, business skills, and then tweaking them towards the social impact, if you can call it like that. And I wondered what is most impactful, because the stereotypical and old-fashioned opinion or impression that people have of social enterprise is that it's run by people who don't have the skills, and a lot of people, And it almost begs the question whether it might be more effective or impactful to educate those people rather than educating people who, the elite business, consultants, or injecting them in the social. I don't know, but from your experience, perhaps it's a reasonable opportunity where you saw that gap. But what is most impactful, do you think?
I think you always need both, probably, or not just those. You need a whole variety of things. Just to clarify, whilst the three people in the room here have finance and consulting backgrounds, we do take other people as well. So about 2/3 to 3/4 of our people have private sector background on the associate program, and within that, I'm now making it up, but maybe 1/3 to 1/2 of those would be from the kind of services, big services background, so legal, finance, consulting, and so on. But a kind of good 1/3 to 1/4 of people are from all kinds of backgrounds, non-profit, charity, occasionally even social enterprise, actually, interestingly enough, public sector, and so on as well. So and that's great. So we're not actually we're interested in finding great people who will go on and have exciting careers and make a lot of difference in the world. I guess we may probably, in how we are set up, we speak more likely to people who come from the private sector because it's kind of most obvious fit. But you raise a perfectly valid point, which is should we do that, or should we be building the capacity of people within this kind of space? Again, I guess I think that's why it's a little bit important to me to kind of think that. I mean, we have historically used the social enterprise language quite a lot, but we've actually, and when we identified ourselves as a social enterprise, and we're very proud of that, but I think we've always seen that we are trying to build talent and develop people who will help bring about a kind of new economy. And that is not just about working in the social enterprise space. That can be about working in big companies, that can be about working in charities. All those forms of organisation actually need to change, and we need to collectively figure out what a new way of producing the goods and services that we need. So from that point of view, I think we're taking certainly now a slightly broader view of that. But your general point of do you build a space by bringing people in or by developing people within it is a very fair one, and I'd say you always need a bit of both, or maybe a lot of both.
That's how we
So to go back to your question, I've got a really hopefully inspirational anecdote for you. I was in a room with the man who started Ethics, which is the ethical trading platform, and he said when he first started, he was trying to contact Goldman Sachs to say, "Come on, let's do something together," and they ignored him completely. Last week, he sort of was saying, "You know what? They're now contacting me to get help to provide a service for their ethical trading platform that Goldman Sachs is setting up." So there is a sea change happening. And my question to Tom would be, if you had to build a tool to help manage what you do, what would that be? What would that look like?
A tool to help manage what we do
On purpose.
kind of quite operationally.
Yeah. What's the challenge that you face?
Oh, many. Which one do you want? Well, maybe I'll pick this one because Eddie here is I should say on purpose only runs because we have an amazing community of people around about us who support us on a voluntary basis. We have people who come and train, we have people who are mentors, and we have people who are coaches for the people going through our programs. And Eddie is one of the people who comes and regularly trains for us, which is always hugely appreciated. And one of the things that we're very aware of is that there's a huge amount of potential in that wider community, which is multiple times the size of the actual community of people who've been on or through the program. We would love to have that magic tool that is able to harness that community much more effectively. From a point of view of networking, collaborating together, exchanging insights and materials, ultimately actually having the conversation about how this better economy needs to look, and how is that going to happen? You know, if we were able to kind of build a tool that could harness that wider community that we have, and ultimately beyond that too, that would be a wonderful kind of magic app that I'd like to be able to switch on.
Hi. Thank you for the great introduction to us. I'm not someone who's not had experience in social enterprise, so it's quite good to get this introduction. My question is about your description of the whole effort of social enterprise, having somehow been carefully sidestepping the question of political engagement. I mean, at some point, if you want a social change, it's not entirely economic. The problems the challenges that we face, it's also political. So do you foresee in the future that this kind of economic way of addressing the question may actually come across sort of a wall which might be sort of more political, and how do you foresee that being sort of managed or dealt with?
Yeah. I probably am even less qualified to talk about that than I am about everything I've talked about so far, which I'm not vastly qualified for either. But that side of things is very important, and I think it needs to come more to the fore. One of the things that I fear is that when I talk about those kind of underlying values that I think I need to change, one of the things I fear is that, I mean, whether you call this a value or not, but I do kind of feel that as a society we quite often kind of we're quite kind of business or economy focused, or markets focused. Maybe it has to do with marketization, as opposed to kind of saying, well, actually we need to kind of, some of this is a political will thing, or when I said it was a will thing, sometimes that's a political will thing and not just an individual will thing. And we need to strengthen our democracy and the participation of people, etc., etc. I think there are parallels of that within the economy. So I think having more democratic ownership structures, more participatory ways of generating the goods and services that we need, and so on, are interesting. And I think if we can kind of get some of those ideas into how we run our economy, that will have mutual benefits with actually hopefully strengthening our political system as well. So it's important, and we need to get better at it, and we need to strengthen it. I think one of the reasons that the political side, at least in the world that I kind of work in, I suppose, is not talked about as much as it maybe ideally should be, is that in many ways governments are kind of way behind on this stuff. I remember we were fortunate enough to have Jonathan Porritt speak to us a couple of years ago, and Jonathan Porritt is a kind of long-term environmental campaigner and founder of something called Form for Future and so on and so forth. And I remember him saying, there are many companies, and I asked him actually in some ways a similar question, which is, so where's government? Why are we not regulating for this stuff? And why is there not the pressure on politicians to make changes happen? And he says, well, he thinks it will come, but at the moment, companies are doing stuff which is way ahead of regulation. They're kind of organising themselves to undertake things that politicians would shrink from ever trying to regulate for. They're almost kind of, companies are almost kind of either motivated to do it or desperate to have some guidance that they're kind of, either doing it by themselves or maybe organising themselves to kind of make it happen. So I think that needs to change, but I think that's part of why in the current narrative it doesn't maybe get talked about enough. And that has to do with, our political setup of how long are people in power for. You're essentially trying to get yourself re-elected in 5 years' time. You don't have a long enough time horizon. All those kind of things, which I'm sure kind of well-rehearsed arguments, which we all know about. but it is one of those things that needs to change as well. And you know, the overall change that we want to have happen is not going to happen unless all parts change. It doesn't happen to be the part that we are expert in or that we work on. So so we'd love to kind of make, you know, support it and say it's important, but it's not our kind of area of expertise.
First of all, thank you so much. This is really inspiring, and just hearing the fear of these people just kind of make you feel like they're finding the purpose, which is good. I had this question because I come from a banking background, and I did mention, and I was wondering, like, how do you choose your partners to collaborate with? Because you would want this 6 months each to be very useful, right? Like, you don't want like people, because there are a lot of people who talk about doing things good, and you know, but like, you know, internally also, like I knew in my bank exactly which group you would want to work for if you wanted to get anything out of 6 months, or which would just talk about it and put you in meetings and you would waste your time. So, like, how would you make sure that you make those 6 months good? So, like, do you kind of select partners? How does it happen?
We do select partners, and the very simple answer to your question is that we have 3 criteria, which is one is that the work that the associate is going to be engaged in needs to combine social and commercial ways of working, or environmental and commercial ways of working. That's not the organisation as a whole, just the work that the associate will be working on. Secondly, it has to add value to the organisation, because if it's not, you know, it's a commercial exchange, and they pay for it, and so therefore, if it's gonna work, it has to add value. And thirdly, it has to be, you know, of the right kind of challenge and interest and so on for the associates doing the work. And that's done in a kind of in a you know, bespoke, if you like, way. You know, we go and meet with people, we go and talk to them, we meet the people that the associate is actually going to be working in. We're hopefully going to meet them in their offices. It's always quite interesting as well. You get a bit of a feel for an organisation that way, etc. Do we get it right every time? No, we don't. But I think we get it right a lot of the time. And you know, being very open. I think, as Ria referred to, sometimes you learn a lot from difficult situations as well as from the placements that just go very smoothly and a kind of slam dunk success. And that can, and on both sides, you know, for the associate and for the organisation.
That would be great if, like, as you mentioned, I think, you know, it's like if you create it more and more, like mainstream companies open up to these, because, you know, associates bring also a very different culture to the company that is very useful. And sometimes you need that kind of enthusiasm, because there's a lot of jaded bankers sitting there, and somebody comes up who wants to change some things, and it's quite good for the company in general. So I think I'm hoping more people recognize that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for that. I think it's been really inspiring listening to the general terms of how the organisation works. But are you allowed to give any really specific factual examples or case studies of a person with a certain type of background who's gone into a very specific organisation, what they've learned, and then how they've changed that organisation, how it's gone forward in a different manner?
Yeah, of course. Well, I'll give one or two, and if any of the associates and fellows here in the room want to provide one or two as well, they're welcome to. The ones I tend to give are from a bit longer ago, when I was actually more closely involved in what was going on in a particular placement. We've worked, for example, for a long time with a social enterprise called HCT Group, who are a local transport provider. They actually run big Red London bus routes here in London and elsewhere in the country as well, commercial bus operations, which obviously has a social purpose within itself, but then they also use the profits that they make from that to subsidise community transport, you know, be that taxis for people who can't get out otherwise, or minibuses for scout groups, or whatever it might be. And this must be back in, I guess, 2010. One of the associates in our very first year actually came there for their first 6 months, and they said, we kind of measure our social impacts a bit anecdotally, a bit haphazardly, but we don't really have a kind of proper framework for how to do this. And we really need to get a bit better at it, because they had actually, interestingly, just had a big social investment deal, which they'd gone through. I think it was the first ever quasi-equity deal done. I think in the world, possibly, certainly in the UK. And our investors want us to be a bit more rigorous about how we measure our impact. So the main project for our associate in that place was to develop the kind of framework for how would they measure their impact. So it's kind of coming up with a set of KPIs that would be, and why are those the important ones, why are those the right ones to use, do they kind of give us a good idea of what impact we're actually generating. But then not only just the kind of framework, but actually then also, okay, how do we collect this? What's the system that we need to get people to fill in to actually provide the data to us and actually kind of implement that and get that going in the first place. HCT has kind of built on that system ever since, as that's one, 2 years or several years down the line, a kind of first award for being, best social enterprise in the UK, or best kind of social impact management system in the UK, etc. And I think there's won more awards since then as well. So that's kind of one very classic example. And that associate, after her year, went on and is now an investment director at Big Society Capital, where certainly in the early days, she also I think had that kind of specialism of impact measurement, which she brought to the job, and I'm sure kind of helped to get that job as well.
I could talk about my whole cohort, to be honest. Someone who comes to mind is Camilla, who during her placement at a place called Paris, which I think is the oldest social enterprise in the UK, and they provide charity, yes. And they provide employment for blind people. During her placement, she launched a totally new ethical soap brand called the Soap Co. And it's a kind of a luxury product. I have it in my bathroom, and it's kind of got this really nice braille finish on the front. And we've got still a WhatsApp group, and every other week she's winning this award and that award. And I don't know which hotel chain they're in now, but I think they're got incredible distribution. She now kind of runs commercial there, and I remember doing a group session, kind of helping her work through the brand strategy, and it's great now to kind of see it in the market.
We all got given 5 different samples of soap to take home, provide market research on, which one we liked and which one smelled better and all this kind of stuff.
I was going to say, it should have been the party fair coming to the top.
It's good fun.
Start wine. Cool.
There isn't such enterprise in Enfield.
Yeah. Well, we can have a chat about that if you are interested, because that is one of our cohort projects.
Oh wow.
Sorry,
what was it?
How many in cohort?
We aim for 18, and we set a maximum of 20 in a cohort.
And there is the salary.
Yes,
it's just
you get paid in the UK £22,500 a year, which it's obviously a very big pay cut for anyone who comes on the salary on the program. But we say to people, think of it more as a kind of living stipend. I think it's just about possible on a bit of a student lifestyle to kind of at least not go backwards in London on that. Depending a little bit on your financial commitments that you have, you may be able to at least kind of not have to eat into your savings.
My addition to that as well is with the kind of salary, you have to factor in, so in the balance of the program, you're only doing a 4.5-day working week because you have the Friday afternoons. You also have 6 hours of executive coaching, which is, I'm guessing, about £500 an hour usually if you want to pay for it. So when you think about the salary, when you trade that off against the uncosted benefits of it, it actually, that investment piece really comes into your mind as well. So yeah, it's very easy to get the salary, but you do think about it with other elements as well.
We've had an alumni who's kind of done a short kind of analysis of how many hours of teaching and so on you get compared to what you might get on a fairly standard MBA or something, and probably get at least as much. And you consider then how much you might pay for an MBA. You've got to take that into account as well.
Was there one more question? A couple more. Please, sir.
Well, I wanted to first, what we are discussing is a micro level, and it's very commendable on this major challenge that we are having. So one could be skeptical and say that on a macro level, these were discussed as we were talking before our sitting down. In the 1970s, people were aware of limit to growth. Governments and universities, companies, limit to growth, energy, the kind of world, Harvard, MIT, Global Rome, and so on. and yet the world went on in spite of all these campaigns, etc., etc. So maybe this awareness and so on a macro level might unfortunately not go as what we wish, because still large population in the world are poor, they don't have electricity and they need coal to burn to generate electricity. The standard of living are still based on using the resources and so on and so forth. Just to be pessimistic. But on the optimistic side, I think these things have moved quite a bit. Again, this is my little note as a sort of workout, not related to this training session that you mentioned, that they were not that useless or lack of without much expectation. They did result in, for example, the amount of oil which is used, how many barrels per $1 million GDP in real terms in the 1970s, compared to today, oil is about 50, 60, 70% less used to generate that unit of GDP. And the same also, this example is that our cars, that the car and the gas guzzlers use how many miles per gallon compared to today. So there is, I think, optimism as far as environmental achievements and are concerned, and then we should not rely only on consumption as a factor of the GDP. And in more practical cases, I think I can share with you that about 13, 14 major oil companies who have set up about a year ago together a fund or a group, $2 billion or something equivalent, to see how they can reduce the loss and emissions or leakages of methane. The oil and gas companies generate methane, and this methane is much more, compared with CO2, is 100 times more effective damages in the environment, causes greenhouse gas. And along that, they have spent a lot of money, all the different companies together, and they have encouraged and set up actual work programs for operations on the well side, distribution, storage, which I think, I had a presentation at the Energy Institute a few weeks ago. I was very impressed. So there is negative, I said, pessimism that all these things are too idealistic. Having you commended you on the micro level, but on the macro and the global poverty and so on, we could be hopeless and disappointed. But there is, I think there is movement, and we can be hopeful.
I agree, and I actually should have maybe stated up front that when I'm the economy that I'm generally talking about is a developed Western economy, because that is where I guess I live and what I understand. I think there is a whole other set of challenges, moral and other, when we then talk about economies that are much poorer, and that is another whole challenge that we also have to solve. But at one level, I think if we don't get our own house in order, it's we stand on very shaky ground when trying to have conversations with other parts of the world as well, which may not be as prosperous as we are. So let's try and do that, and like other countries leapfrogged fixed net phone networks, they might leapfrog some energy solutions and so on as well.
We've done 2 more questions, and then the panel are calling us back there.
How do you match associates with their placements? Do you sort of assess people's existing skill set and challenge them, but also try and utilize it, or is it just completely random, sort of what comes in the door?
Well, it's not completely random. These are quite specific questions, which is great about the program. So let me run through briefly. So we both sides, both the organisations and the associates, sign up to the program before they know who they will be matched with. So you have to, at one level, both sides need to make a leap of faith that this is what they want to do. We then have a 2-stage process where both sides can express preferences but not choices about who they want to be matched with. The first round happens on paper. The organisations get the CVs, you get a write-up from the organisations about what it's about. The second round is basically a speed dating round where you meet 8 organisations for 20 minutes each and vice versa. And in both after both rounds, both sides submit ranked preferences to us, and we put those, it's actually relatively mathematical to actually put them through an algorithm that tries to optimize the system. We then obviously need to kind of apply our common sense and judgment to that as well, and we look over it and then sometimes we need to tweak it a little bit. But we're basically trying to maximize preferences on both sides, rather than saying that, you know, we somehow know, you know, you would be best for this organisation, or vice versa.
Yeah, well, my question was a bit related to yours, which obviously points to, you know, ideally there'd be a bigger political push for these kind of changes, and you obviously it's due to the short-term nature of politics. It's a people-pleasing business, so it's easy for us to sit here and say, you know, we're in this kind of mindset of, you know, things should improve and people should make more ethical choices and so on. Reality is probably 95% of the country isn't even thinking like that. So what exists today to try to address that and kind of get more of that mindset among the general population, whether it's charity or social impact investment firms, or do you see trends towards actually trying to do that?
Well, and I think one of the just really important things that we can all do is actually, there are a huge number of exciting things happening, you know, in the UK and in other economies and in other parts of the world, where people are genuinely doing things differently. You know, be that the community transport company that we just talked about, be that you know, local currencies, or more generally complementary currencies, things like the Brixton pound or time banking and so on, which I think are fascinating. You know, there are lots of things out there that actually are genuinely doing things differently, and I think one of the ways that we can try and shift people or make them recognize that there are different ways of organizing ourselves is to make those things stronger and better and bigger, and get them known by more people, but even actually before they're strong and big and good, we can just talk about them, you know, because that is a way of, I talked about needing to change our fundamental values, you know, that is, a lot of how that happens is through storytelling, you know, and actually, if we all went out, you know, after this afternoon and kind of told all our friends about, you know, two things or two organisations that we were all really inspired about, and that we thought genuinely kind of did something differently and according to a different set of values, which if everyone was to adopt would actually move us significantly in the right direction, you know, that already would have quite a big impact. And so I think it's not to be underestimated, that kind of very soft power that we all have, and which we all exercise through what we say and what we think and what examples we decide to talk about. And the more we talk about them, the more people will know about them, the more people will want to kind of buy from them or do business with them, the more normal it will become. And conversely, the more difficult it will become to do business or to run your organisation in a way that is not really in line with an economy that genuinely works for all.
I would just add to that.